Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome to City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights Booksellers and Publishers events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravelis, and as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It is always a privilege and an honor to be able to do so. Today, we are delighted to welcome back to the house after many moons our dearly beloved Daniel Pinchbeck. We have had the great pleasure of hosting him in the past, going back to his very first book, Breaking Open the Head. Daniel is a philosopher, futurist, cultural critic, and New York Times best-selling author. He was featured in J.O. Amorim's documentary 2012, Time for Change. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Chicago Tribune, Art in America, Rolling Stone, and Wired, amongst other publications. In the 90s, he was the co-founder of the literary magazine Open City. Later, he co-founded the pioneering web magazine Reality Sandwich. He's also the founder of the think tank Center for Planetary Culture. His published work includes the aforementioned Breaking Open the Head, also 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, How Soon Is Now, also When Plants Dream, and Notes from the Edge Times. His most recent book is titled The Occult Control System. Daniel is the director of the research center known as The Elevator. He's also the founder of Liminal News, which is an extension of the Liminal Institute. So we'll be talking with him about his research, his insights, his views on where we're all headed. And we'll also make room for a Q&A at the end of the discussion. We ask that you post your questions in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. We will also be posting links with which you may purchase books and also links to Daniel's web portals. So Daniel Pinchbeck, welcome to City Lights. It is a delight and a pleasure to have you with us once again.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, you and I have been having a nice back and forth for the last few years as we've been paying attention to whatever's happening out there.
Yeah. So much of your work addresses the devastating and multidimensional planetary crisis we are all facing. I mean, you've described it as a crisis of consciousness. And in your analysis, you've drawn from systems thinkers, esoteric traditions, shamanism, psychedelics, as well as contemporary social theory. And I'd like to begin by talking about some of the root ideas that inform the foundations of your work. I mean, where do the threads of your thinking come from, and how do they coalesce?
Yeah. That's a big question. What part of that do you want me to address?
So I'm thinking about influences. I'm thinking about, because I know right now we talked a little bit about Rudolf Steiner. We talked about, just some of the ideas that have come to inform you, but also your research in psychedelics, your experiences with psychedelics.
Well, as you know, a very important influence on me were actually the Beat Generation. Because my mother, who you've also done things with, is an author, Joyce Johnson, and she wrote a book called Minor Characters, among other works, which was a memoir of her early life, growing up on the Upper West Side in New York, and then she made friends with a woman who was sort of Allen Ginsberg's girlfriend for a while before Allen had figured out that he was gay. And then Allen set her up on a blind date with Jack Kerouac, and they went out for a year and a half during this crucial threshold in Kerouac's life and career, where his book On the Road came out after being just sort of shelved for 10 or whatever years it was. So, and then she saw in a way that this burst of fame actually kind of ruined him, because it accelerated his alcoholism and he couldn't really handle the pressures that it brought. So I grew up a little bit with Allen Ginsberg, a little bit with Ferlinghetti. He used to come hang out with my mom. Then I went to college at Wesleyan in Connecticut, and I was really happy there. I dropped out, and I started working in magazines. And then in my mid to late 20s, I began to feel I was also working on poetry and fiction, editing a literary magazine with friends. And but I recognized that I'd come from a secular materialist sort of worldview, which assumed that consciousness was completely brain-based and a physical kind of property of the brain. And that didn't leave any room for anything transcendent or any kind of spirituality or anything. So then I remembered some psychedelic experiences from college, and really the Beats, once again, like, they had been pioneers with psychedelics. I mean, Burroughs had written the Yahe letters. Ginsberg had convinced Timothy Leary to kind of take LSD to the masses in the early 60s and so on. So, and I was good friends with Michael Brownstein, who was a poet who used to date Alan Waldman, and he introduced me to ayahuasca and so on. So that led to my first book, Breaking Open the Head, that was on psychedelic shamanism. That came out in 2002. And I think, yeah, like, um, that was the start of my kind of my journey. Then my second book. So then I had all these different experiences with indigenous contexts, and sometimes out of them. I met Sasha Shulgin, who's the famous psychedelic chemist. Interviewed him. I went to Burning Man for Rolling Stone. I wrote about Burning Man the first time. I think it was 1999 or something, 2000. And that was very eye-opening. Because in the East Coast, there really wasn't a psychedelic culture. People just made fun of psychedelics and mocked them and thought they were stupid. So then realizing that this was such an essential tool for exploring consciousness, I began to question. Also, I had a lot of sort of psychic experiences, paranormal, telepathic, synchronistic, like weird shit that, my worldview had not allowed for that to be real. So then when it actually started happening to me often I had to reevaluate, yeah, like what was the epistemology of my culture, the knowledge system, what was real, what was not real. And so that led me to, Breaking Open the Head. And the second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, recently republished as Quetzalcoatl Returns, was looking at the prophecies of a number of different indigenous cultures, including the Maya and the Hopi and the sort of Aztecs. Also looking at the Western ideas around the apocalypse from a Jungian perspective. Carl Jung and his follower Edward Edinger saw the apocalypse as ultimately a psychological event. Edinger talked about it as the coming of the self into conscious realization, and their understanding was that it was something that was happening. It was already happening, but it was also imminently kind of inescapable. So yeah, so you asked me kind of influences. So it was the Beats, then it was the literary influences. I used to read a lot of novels and poetry. Now I don't do that as much, Rilke and so on. And now, then it became more these kind of, philosophers in consciousness, like Gurdjieff, Rudolf Steiner, Jean Gebser's book, The Ever-Present Origin, was very important for me. Some anthropologists. I had a teacher at Columbia, but I had a fellowship for Mick Tausig, and he introduced me to, or deepened my engagement with Walter Benjamin, who became a very big influence on my books. I could go on from there, but that was how I got going in a way.
Yeah. And through your Liminal News platform, you've been engaging with an eclectic variety of contemporary thinkers who've been studying the crisis of our time, and they run a pretty broad spectrum in terms of their thinking. Culling from their offerings, I mean, what would you say are some of the most useful ideas that have emerged recently from your discussions? Are you seeing patterns in what people are saying? I mean, where's the synthesis in a lot of this? I mean, is there one?
Hmm. Well, I mean, when I wrote 2012, which came out in 2006, I actually made a shift myself from, secular materialism or physicalism, passing through shamanism and panpsychism to ultimately arrive at kind of what's called monistic or analytic idealism, which essentially argues that consciousness is the foundational layer rather than anything material or physical. So it's like a universe of consciousness that actually expresses itself in sort of transitory physical expressions in a way. But even those physical expressions are ultimately of consciousness. In the same way when we have a dream, we experience these solid environments, but those are actually just mental objects, mental projections. So the argument from idealism is that everything is ultimately a mental projection in that sense of this underlying field of mentation or field of consciousness or awareness, which is, identical to sort of Tibetan Buddhist ideas or Dzogchen ideas around like primordial awareness of the nature of mind. But there's a number of contemporary thinkers who are expressing this idea that, kind of new levels of subtlety and sophistication. One of them being Bernardo Kastrup, who's I think he's a Dutch philosopher who wrote Dreamed Up Reality and Why Materialism is Baloney. And he also synthesizes, as I did in the 2012 book, idealism with kind of Carl Jung and the ideas of the archetypes and so on. So yeah, you're asking me of the recent thinkers, what's very engaging. Well, for me, the Kastrup is very engaging in that kind of because from my perspective, idealism correlates very nicely with what we're learning about from quantum physics and the discovery that the nature of reality or the nature of the universe is not locally real. That somehow it's an interaction between kind of like the subjective awareness, participatory consciousness, and this sort of energetic field of potentiality and so on. So that I think weaves very well into this idealism, which is also basically what Eastern metaphysics supports. So this idea that we could actually have a kind of foundational understanding of the universe that allows for the psyche, allows for the paranormal, the supernatural, and all these things which you can have direct experiences of if you need to, if you want to, but doesn't violate the scientific method. So I feel now we're seeing this kind of regressive return to Christianity and so on, and there is like a desperate search for meaning, and there is a sense that secular materialism didn't offer people enough meaning or enough purpose or enough of a shape for their lives. And so what we're sort of seeing is a collapse or regression back into some people are going for nihilism, some materialism, and other people are now gravitating more towards Christianity that's being woven into this like right-wing project and so on. So I feel that idealism, while it's still, because it's intellectually kind of like sophisticated, it's still a bit of a marginal, way of understanding the nature of reality. But I think it's very important that become, better shared and parsed and enter into the collective field, which, Kastrup is trying to do. Donald Hoffman is another one. Neil Teese, Notes on Complexity is another one. Amit Goswami, who's an Indian quantum physicist who wrote books like Physics of the Soul and The Self-Aware Universe, is another idealist who's trying to show how quantum mechanics and kind of this idea that consciousness is the underlying basis of reality can really help us have a different perspective on things like reincarnation and the subtle bodies and so on. So there's a integration, and I guess I still kind of sense that this is still cutting edge and sort of ahead of its time right now, but I think that is very important. And then so what other ideas are actually really useful right now? I think that's like the most useful because I don't know. I mean, it's looking doomy and gloomy on the sort of social and political and ecological front right now. So, maybe part of our task is to integrate these, other more esoteric layers as we pass through whatever this transition is. I mean, in the very near, I mean, right now, I'm writing a lot about artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, or artificial superintelligence. I'm going to offer a course in July, like a month-long seminar with guest speakers, kind of like really, because it feels like there's a huge societal gap right now where, we have like, basically all of these major figures in AI are telling us that we're going to have AGI in 1 to 3 years, and that's going to change everything. Like Sam Altman keeps saying that the difference between where we are now and when AGI hits is the same difference between like the year 1500 and today. So everything obviously changed from 1500 to today. So they're basically telegraphing. They think that this is like an immense shift. And frankly, I mean, AGI is already, somewhat here in the level of intelligence and sophistication that these machines already have. But, when you incorporate agents, so basically you'll have AGI is basically the time when an AI can do anything on a computer, whether it's programming, whether it's media, whether it's, we'll see, novel writing, poetry, better than any human can do it, And at that point, like a huge amount of the jobs that people rely on, have spent their lives training for, and so on, become obsolete. And we either go into a much more desperate scenario, or we figure out how to share the kind of social wealth that these systems will be generating.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to remind everyone, we will be having a Q&A, so please do post your questions and comments in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. So we come to techno-feudalism as a term is coined by Yanis Varoufakis. We are watching civil society dissolve before our very eyes, both nationally and on the world stage. Do you see any opportunities that emerge as the result of this catastrophe? I mean, what should we be thinking about as we all decide how to position ourselves for the deluge? And what role does community play in all of this?
Sure. I mean, it's um, right. I'm trying to remember. You had a nice phrase. You talked about the weeds going up between the concrete blocks. I think I'm
Right.
getting more interested in the weeds these days. Um, so yeah, I mean, little micro communities or larger communities can be like that. I guess the little currents of life within the sort of dominant structure. I mean, I'm very intrigued by the prospect that, like it's not totally determined yet which way it will go. And there's no reason why we couldn't use AI and AGI to create, more participatory, more humane and democratic systems. So I've been reading Audrey Tang. Do you know who she is? I've been reading her book Plurality, and she's fascinating. She was a trans woman from Taiwan who was part of a student movement there, and then the government actually decided to work with them, and they ended up making her the digital minister. And then they were trying to figure out how do they make democracy work better and be more responsive. And so under her management, they built a whole set of tools so that people can create their own proposals. And if a proposal gets over 5,000 votes, then it actually has to be taken seriously by the government and looked at. So ultimately, there was very low trust in government in Taiwan. It was like 20-30%. And then after they implemented these tools that Audrey Tang helped, it went up to like 70-80%. It became one of the most successful democracies in the world. And it's just very well thought out because they're under, just as we're under information warfare from Russia. I mean, you could look at what's happening to us right now is actually we've lost a war against Russia for the time being, and maybe for a long time if we're not careful. They're in a similar battle with China, who you would think would even be a more dangerous adversary. So they do things like pre-bunking, where if they think that China may be about to flood them with like deep fake videos or made up, stories and so on, they'll be able to use these communications networks set up by the government to warn everybody or to train everybody in how to be on their guard against deep fake content from China. So there is a set of tools that are available to restore and replenish democracy through the digital world. And there's no reason, in theory, why those couldn't also be implemented here. But obviously, that's not going to happen through the federal government at this point. But yeah, so that kind of thing makes me somewhat hopeful. And I don't know what else there is I could answer for your question, but yeah.
Well, speaking of hopeful, I want to talk about the elevator. It is a research center whose goal is to raise planetary consciousness. The idealism option is a kind of a manifesto that has arisen from this entity. I want to let everyone know we posted links in the chat with which, if we go to Daniel's website, you can learn more about this manifesto. I believe you can download it or get a hard copy. So, where have your mind experiments and your current research taken you with the elevator?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're also working on a project around AI and consciousness, but that was our first paper, and kind of the argument is that a kind of large scale paradigm shift from materialism to idealism would most likely have profound political and societal benefits in a way, consequences, benefits. Yeah, when the underlying kind of paradigm shifts, everything ultimately tends to shift with that. So hundreds of years ago, we shifted from a theological perspective to more of a scientific perspective, and that led to sort of atomization and hyper-individuation and so on. It's possible that a kind of deeper realization of interconnectivity and the sort of underlying field of consciousness and so on could be, yeah, a path to, deeper systems change and social transformation. Um, I think in the book we talked about what's her name? The woman who did the Club of Rome, systems theorists. I've lost her name for the second, but anyway, her whole thing was that, like, if you want to intervene in a system, the highest level point of intervention is actually the underlying paradigm. So yeah, that's kind of like what we're thinking about with this. 'Cause, when you have the bias around materialism, it can be a very unconscious bias, and it leads to kind of competitive ideas, Darwinian, survival of the fittest, kind of like it sort of validates exploitation and control because there's sort of an underlying nihilism. And if we were to sort of like sink into, surrender into this sort of more blissful kind of tantric non-dual perspective, yeah, we wouldn't be so tight around like trying to control everything.
Yeah, yeah. Zach points out in the chat.
Donatello
Meadows.
Meadows, correct?
Yeah. Thank you for that,
Yeah.
Zach. I want to shift gears a sec. You have a new book out. It's called The Occult Control System, UFOs, Aliens, and Other Dimensions and Future Timelines. Let's talk a little bit about spooky here. What are you addressing in this new work?
Yeah, that's not so new anymore, by the way. That was a few years ago. But well, it's been a long-term interest and something I keep returning to. So in the, even back in Breaking Open the Head, I talked a little bit about DMT and kind of abduction experiences. Then in 2012, I actually studied the crop circles in England in depth. And I guess, like, as I mentioned, when I started looking into psychedelics in the late 90s, they were very much ridiculed and mocked and repressed. And then they turned out to be so incredibly, important, as, now they've been embraced by science and corporations. There's a whole new, kind of psychedelic renaissance happening. So I became a little bit more aware that sometimes when a subject was like mocked and ridiculed and marginalized and repressed, it might be that it deserved that, or it might be that it was something that was just too much for people. Like people somehow couldn't integrate it into their worldview and so on. So that kind of led me through a winding path to study the crop circles, which seems very linked to this, kind of ideas around 2012 as the beginning of a dimensional shift or something. So yeah, and the more I got into it, the more fascinating. I mean, that would be a very long unpacking as to, why I ended up thinking that there's good reasons to believe. I would say that not all of the crop circles are made by human beings or teams of human beings, and some of them were just too virtuosic or appeared too quickly. Or there was also when I mean, I stayed there for a whole summer, and I would, we would get in the car, and we'd go every morning to where the latest one arrived, and you'd feel the sort of energetic shift in the formations. You could see like kind of dowsing pendulums pull off center, and so. Let's see. Okay, we've got a question here. We can like get that in a second. So yeah, so I maintained a long-standing interest. I think that there easily could be other forms of consciousness, like a whole ecology of consciousness. There could be subtler dimensions, and these forms of consciousness interacting with us. And maybe they've always interacted with us. Maybe it's not so much of a literal, physical alien being that flies to Earth. That's not totally impossible either. However, over the last few years, somehow as this subject has been picked up, like psychedelics, more and more by the mainstream culture, it's sort of begun to like annoy me or make me feel a little bit like queasy, and I felt like a little pulling away from it because I don't know, it already feels like we have like alien consciousness happening, like we have an alien. Like, I don't know what Donald Trump and these people are. They seem like yeah, it's like this very old story of like some narcissist psychopaths who enjoy inflicting cruelty and so on. That already feels like a very alien consciousness. Then we have this sort of summoning of this sort of synthetic sentience or mimesis of sentience through AI and so on. So I feel like we've got our hands full right now, and I feel the way now, sort of like the right wing actually has kind of glommed on to kind of ETs and UFOs. I don't know. It's kind of like put me off a little bit. It almost feels like it's another distraction mechanism right now.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we're caught in a universe that sort of sandwiched between Bataille and Philip K. Dick.
Mm.
you know. Let's see, what's this question? So Donovan says, how about this postulate? Conspiracy theories are the new psychedelics. The Trump revolution is being enacted by evil hippies personified by Musk, Kennedy, Bannon, Tabbert. Conspiracy theories are a perspective changer powered by satisfying deep emotional and psychological grievances, question mark.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, recently I had an opportunity to interview. Well, I went to this event called Hereticon that Peter Thiel's Founders Fund put on Miami, and I ended up writing about it a bit for Playboy. And among the people I met there was this guy Curtis Yarvin, who's considered, very influential on Thiel and on J.D. Vance and so on. And yeah, he basically believes, I mean, I think he probably started out trolling. I mean, he was from like, left-wing intelligentsia, East Coast background, similar to mine. But then he, I guess thought he was very smart, and software engineers were the smartest people in the world, and tech CEOs were even smarter than them. And so somehow like he developed this whole, kind of philosophy slash like psychological defense structure, which basically proposes that the United States and other countries should be run as tech corporations, where the president is actually the CEO dictator who has
Technocracy.
absolute power.
Yeah.
Yeah, or neocameralism, he calls it. And sometimes I might, I think I don't know if he's been to Burning Man, but he often has long hair. He, has done psychedelics. He has, weird, funky like girlfriends. They just happen to be very right wing. So I think there's some truth to that. That like, it feels like there's resentful, angry hippies. But then you have people like Peter Thiel, who was did the Stanford Review. He actually was a right wing ideologue long before he was a tech person. And then I think he just saw that tech was the avenue to bring about his political ideology and political ambitions, which I guess is what these guys want for whatever reason, is to, make America like apartheid South Africa again, and terrorize everybody, and control and take over as much wealth as they possibly can. It's a very pathetic, I think, kind of worldview.
Well, I was fascinated by the Curtis Yarvin interview because he was so obsessed with trying to control the narrative as the two of you were talking. It was just to the point of, he was trying to create this categorization to kind of box you in. And it was really so much less about like a dance and more about him trying to impose an obsessive kind of order. It was really fascinating to listen to.
Yeah,
It was
it was
weird.
painful. Yeah, it was weird. And I think that one thing that, these guys, and why you can't win in conversation with them, is they've learned these, over the last decades, because they, basically they wanted to, yeah, kind of like outgun the liberal and progressive and sort of, neo-left intellectuals. So they learned these very ponderous rhetorical strategies, where essentially, like with Jordan Peterson or with Yarvin, it wouldn't matter, or, if you made the interview 1 hour, 5 hours, 20 hours, they would still doing these rhetorical spins, and so you can really never actually get to the point. Yeah, as you say, they can sort of try to keep controlling the narrative like that, even though really what's behind it is nothing very useful for us.
I mean, do they realize the way in which they're shooting themselves in the foot by doing that, though?
Well, I think it's hard to say which they're shooting themselves in the foot right now, as they've taken over this power and control that they've always, beyond their wildest dreams, I would say at this point.
Yeah, but then there's the serpent eating its own tail eventually.
Yeah, the serpent can take a long time to eat its tail, and it could be, you never know, like, right? Like, sometimes empires start like the Roman Empire, and they go on for hundreds of years, or,
Yeah.
however long. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Rudolf Steiner because we both seem to have an interest in Steiner, and I think his concept of Ahriman, his cosmology, I find a really fascinating one. As we were talking in the green room before people arrived, actually, my intro to him was through his architecture. I mean, he was really a multifaceted guy. I mean, like you mentioned as we were talking, he's also into creating dances, choreography, all kinds of stuff. How did you come to him, and what does he mean to you now in your work? I mean, you're teaching a workshop on him.
Yeah, I just did that. It's still up on the Liminal News website. But yeah, well, he became very important for me. I mean, in Breaking Open the Head, actually, I had a friend, I don't know if he's still San Francisco based. My friend Neil Martinson was a Steiner devotee. And basically, I'd had these, I'd been doing these many, many psychedelic experiences. They'd started to sort of like bleed over into the real world in a way. Like there were sort of diabolical kind of entities and just weird shit was happening, like, paranormal stuff and so on. And then I started looking in the occult literature, and I read Aleister Crowley, and Castaneda, and I just started to get this very dark, vibe around the occult worlds, like they seem like being in Times Square in like 1975 or something, with Travis Bickle as your taxi driver or something like that. And so it was making me very depressed. Then I ran into Neil, and in one night he gave me his understanding of Steiner's whole cosmology. And then I read many, many books and all the lectures, which are all online. His entire body of work is basically online. And yeah, I mean, it's a lot to sort of go into. I mean, Steiner, I think he was born in 1865, maybe in it's like Croatia or Austro-Croatian border. I don't know, something like that. And yeah, as a child, he just had kind of psychic abilities. The spirits of the dead would visit him. He saw into these other worlds. And so he realized slowly that people didn't have that ability around him, that somehow it was like an atavistic ability that maybe people had had long ago, but in the modern world, they kind of lost it. And so he had this leftover ability. And I, kind of wonder if, I mean, from, this would be a reductive scientific perspective, but it'd be like maybe he just had a very active pineal gland that was producing the kind of DMT that, because a lot of the visions he describes are things that really resonated with my experiences in ayahuasca and sort of deep trance states. But he then laid out this very, very elaborate esoteric and occult cosmology where he talked about kind of that, there were different worlds and different bodies and all these like different layers of beings and how they interacted. It was just a very incredible kind of map of the sort of multidimensional reality. And so Steiner talked about how at this level of development, humans have four bodies. We have the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the I or the ego. The I are, so we're also in the fourth incarnation of the earth. And, for Steiner, both humans incarnate again and again, and the earth itself also goes through reincarnation cycles. And in fact, Steiner said that the mission of his life on earth, as he understood it, was to bring this knowledge of reincarnation back to the earth. And he wrote all these books called Karmic Relationships, where he traced different like Western individualities like Goethe and Engels through their different lives in history. And yeah, so he talked about how we were in this fourth incarnation of the earth, and it was this time where we were developing our individualized consciousness, separating out from the group, and that actually, he was an esoteric Christian, and that Christ's incarnation for him was actually this sort of epochal event in human evolution where we kind of, Christ said, leave your fathers and, mothers and brothers, whatever, to follow me. So it was really about separating from the group and then finding your way back to like the divine source. One of Steiner's students, Owen Barfeld, kind of talked about it in his book as the shift from original participation to final participation, where after you gain the sort of self-consciousness and reflective self-awareness, you're then able to utilize that to find a path back to the sort of integration with the whole. But yeah, and so as you mentioned, as an esoteric Christian, Steiner looked at different elements of Christian mythology or theology, and in some cases he kind of developed it in very interesting ways. And so Steiner argued that there were these super sensible worlds and beings, that we may encounter in drugs or in trance states or possession states or in dreams. They're working on us all of the time. And but some of them seek to, there's angelic forces and guardian angels in Steiner's cosmology, but there are also these, more, beings that sort of like try to pull us into a path of evolution that's useful for them. And the two main ones that he talked about are the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic. So Lucifer means light bringer. Actually, the magazine that Steiner had when he started anthroposophy, his movement when he broke off from theosophy, was called Lucifer Gnosis. So Lucifer is basically a very important and kind of ennobling force for humanity. So Lucifer kind of leads us to like beauty and glamour and genius, but also kind of like arrogance and haughtiness. Lucifer is a class of beings or a force that sort of pulls us up and away from the earth. And then there's the Ahriman, which is the evil earth spirit from Zoroastrianism, who has the opposite. He's pulling us, Ahriman pulls us down into the material realm, into sterile rationality and into technology. Just as Christ incarnated 2,000 years-ish ago, and Steiner argued that Lucifer had once incarnated in the form of a human being, and that Ahriman was going to incarnate. So Ahriman being the sort of spirit of rational calculation, technology. It really does feel that what we're seeing with AI as it develops more and more autonomy and as it builds bodies for itself with robotics or potentially with biotechnology, this really couldn't be more. It's like a reification of Steiner's idea of this Ahrimanic incarnation. So Steiner felt that the incarnation of Ahriman was not something that could be avoided for humanity. It was just a necessary stage in our evolutionary development. But the more people who understood it in a spiritual sense and were doing their own inner work and their own occult development, the better humanity would be prepared as a whole for this threshold, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How do you incorporate that into your practice?
My main practice is really the writing and the reflecting, the thinking. That's kind of all I can really do. Sometimes I might meditate a little bit. But for me, that's the sort of, I guess the writing and trying to be, truthful and trying to like figure out what seems to be the sort of essence of what's happening is a spiritual practice. And so that for me is why, I'd love it if people who are on this would sign up for the newsletter, Daniel Pinchbeck, .substack.com, because that is really like what I'm trying to do all the time and try to take, big issues and sort of, kind of deconstruct them, analyze their different parts and try to figure out, not only how we got into these situations, but also in theory or in practice, is there a way to get out of them? Like the idea of could we use artificial intelligence to, reunite with the planet and reconnect and build resilient, regenerative, participatory systems? Is that possible? Does it have to go in this tech feudalist direction? Stuff like that.
I'm very curious about when you have AI that is very much headed in that direction, pitted against AI, which is going in the opposite direction. And it's kind of like when Kasparov lost to Big Blue and they said, well, what do you think about this? And he's like, well, I wonder what it'd be like if it was another Big Blue and I against Big Blue, right? So we have another, let's see, another question. This is from Hal. Do you see a link between Steiner and Gurdjieff, particularly in terms of dance?
Yeah, I think that Steiner and Gurdjieff are kind of similar figures. In a way, Meyer Baba could be considered similar. When it was just sort of like the early 20th century, kind of understanding that the modern Western psyche, European and American psyche was, had moved into this very, very restricted realm with this, very dogmatic, rationality. Bertrand Russell, the universe is a desolate ruin, and we're all destined to nothingness and so on. So these were like different attempts coming from different directions. With Gurdjieff, it seems likely that he was, from what I've studied and read, maybe he found a Sufi monastery, maybe in Afghanistan, and they trained him and sent him back to Europe, to kind of like see if there was a way to develop a method or a school to work with the deviant Western psyche. And so he developed this whole like fourth way teaching where he was like getting people to move these like, large stones from one side of a garden to the other. He talks about remembering yourself, self-remembering, that people have the big tendency to forget themselves all the time. And fascinating thinker. The best kind of like develop, kind of explanation, I guess, of his whole system was actually done by his pupil Uspensky before they had a big falling out. That was the book In Search of the Miraculous, and I love it. I think there's a huge amount there, but it's sort of a different. And he also saw himself as an esoteric Christian, so there's some overlap. There's also a lot of differential. Somebody actually who really helped me think through these kind of occult systems and esoteric systems, which sometimes overlap, sometimes are coherent, sometimes don't seem to have coherence, was actually William Irwin Thompson, who is a great 20th century cultural critic and mystic, visionary thinker, who I think has unfortunately been kind of like eclipsed or whatever, but or he's not thought about very much at the moment. His son Evan Thompson writes a lot about Buddhism and kind of cognitive science and so on. But Thompson talked about how, yeah, like we're talking about these things that are in this like subtle, more like quantum dimension. They have an aesthetic component to them, and it's like even the language we use maybe sort of like shapes them or shapes our relationship to them. So these different sort of maestros who develop these occult cosmologies, you could look at them more as like almost like musical composers, like Bach versus like Beethoven or Mozart or something, where like they have similarities of like theme, but also differences in like emphases and harmonic structures and so on.
Yeah. Donovan says Gurdjieff probably made up that monastery, but he definitely borrowed from Sufism, as did Meher Baba, and the Sufi philosophers touched on a lot of what you're discussing. Hal says William Thompson and Evan noted. Thank you. What is your take on Mitch Horowitz?
Yeah, William Thompson's book Coming into Being is a fantastic, particularly the essay he has about the Indian cosmologies and the sort of one thing that he saw, which I think about a lot, particularly in terms of psychedelics. So another thing is like I was, originally, a big advocate and proponent of psychedelics, and I really hoped, that ayahuasca, maybe in particular, and iboga, which I also worked with in Africa, could have a profoundly positive impact on collective consciousness. So now I'm in a little bit of a state of disappointment and how these have been sort of assimilated more into these sort of entrepreneurial and sort of capitalist programs quite easily in a way. And we could talk about that more if you're interested. But Thompson, writing in that book, I think it was like 97 or maybe 2002 or something, I can't remember. But he was talking about how the use of so much use of psychedelic drugs and other drugs in the sort of electronic media sphere, he felt were eroding the boundary between the physical and the psychic in a way that was allowing kind of like ambiguous or even demonic entities to kind of leak more and more into the physical and material world. And also that, the greatest kind of ideology that would allow this to happen would be materialism, which completely denied the existence of subtle beings and subtle realities. So actually, if you look at somebody like Elon Musk, who is resoundingly known to be a ketamine addict and uses it all the time, I would say that Musk is actually, to me, shows a lot of the signs of being possessed by demonic entities that he probably encountered in his ketamine experiments and maybe with other psychedelics too, and is not aware that those things have kind of like taken possession of him to a great degree.
Mm. Michael
comments. You want to know about Mitch Horowitz?
Yes. Michael says, you say you want a revelation. The Steiner course is excellent. And I want to make a little comment actually for how, one of the things that I noticed about Gurdjieffian dance, this is specifically involving Willem Nyland and some of his people. The movements resemble Yang style Tai Chi. Like some of them have a lot of commonality to that form. I don't know why, but it just seemed kind of odd to me. There was a lot of similarity between that and the Yang style. So for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Let me see if there's any other comments.
Well, there was a question about Mitch Horowitz.
Yeah. Okay.
So Mitch was actually my editor. So I published the first book, Breaking Open the Head, with Broadway Books. At that point, Penguin was a different publishing house. And I had a great editor at Random House, Jerry Howard. He was a legendary editor. And he really loved, he liked the first book. And then when I wrote 2012, in the course of writing that book, I had this very insane, kind of overwhelming experience while I was working with Santo Daime in the Amazon in Brazil, where what announced itself as the Mesoamerican, deity Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, popped up in my head and spoke inside my head for a week, explaining that it wanted me to take down a transmission and then include it in my book. And it was a very, not something I believed was possible. But then, after the fact, I was like, oh, like, that happened to like Moses, it happened to like Muhammad, like, it happened to Joseph Smith. If you get out of, it took me a while to kind of distance myself a little bit, but there does seem to be this thing of like, revelation appearing in the form of another voice or transmission, or channeling or something. So when I put that into the book, Jerry, at first, he had me rewrite the whole book, which I did. He was right, it wasn't very good. And then it was really, I felt quite good and ended up becoming like a bestseller and kind of a big book back in 2007, 2007, 8. But Jerry couldn't handle that, the sort of level that I went into around this transmission. So I ended up leaving Random House and not really having another publisher. But then I started synchronistically running into Mitch Horowitz, and at Penguin, he ended up taking on the book. So that was before he had sort of declared himself as kind of like the proponent of like the New Thought philosophy. I have mixed feelings around the New Thought philosophy, and I mean, Mitch is this really sweet guy, and I like him, but I don't know about maybe I just need to go a little bit deeper. But it feels like kind of like very American, kind of like pragmatic approach to occultism. I mean, it's interesting also that as we could look at Trump in many different ways. In fact, I recommend that movie, The Apprentice, is pretty interesting right now. But one way to think about Trump is actually he's the most successful practicing occultist of our time, because Trump actually grew up in the church of Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote the book The Power of Positive Thinking. And apparently Trump had terrible ADHD and he couldn't listen to anything for very long, but he would sit for hours like rapt, focused on Norman Vincent Peale. I guess later on, Roy Cohen had the same effect on him. And so the idea that Peale put out was that if you want to accomplish something, you deprogram yourself of any thought that you're not going to accomplish it, or that, there's not even the possibility that, it couldn't happen. So Trump has, very, very dogmatically applied this idea plus the Roy Cohen ideas like deny, attack, attack on the world. And we can see the impact that's had. I mean, in terms of like, this whole thing, I won the 2020 election, and now it's like, if you want to be part of Trump's administration, you have to take some kind of like oath, or you have to declare that you believe that Trump won the 2020 election. I mean, and now we're seeing this whole bending of reality towards, whatever Trump thinks, and how he has all these people going along with it. It's quite a terrifying act of fascist hypnosis, really.
Nothing is true, everything is permitted.
Everything I say is true if I'm saying it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we are coming to the top of the hour. Is there anything you're working on right now that you want people in the room to know about? Stuff coming up?
Sure. I mean, the one of the things. I mean, obviously the newsletter is ongoing, but on my course platform, liminal.news, which I just put, as well as there being courses that I already did that people could take if they want to. We've also got an upcoming course on artificial general intelligence, and I've just basically finished putting together the structure for that today. So that'll be in July. So if you just sign up, subscribe or whatever, then we'll send you info about that. But kind of like as I said, we have this thing coming that, according to all these guys, is the most transformative technology in human history ever. And we have basically no preparation for it. Like, obviously our government is not going to do anything. Other governments around the world, I think, are just too behind the curve and even understanding what this is. Maybe China has some way of understanding, but if this lays off, millions, particularly white collar workers at first, and until we have, until the AGI starts to iterate on itself and create like humanoid robots and so on, which will probably happen pretty quickly. So like, legal aides, accountants, call service people, like huge industries, I mean, Zuckerberg is talking about they'll be able to lay off basically all, senior programmers within a year. So these are people who spent their whole lives, gaining these skills, and they are going to be obliterated. You know, um, so that as a student of radical movements and political movements, there is something like kind of interesting about that. I mean, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart were these political philosophers who wrote these books, A Multitude and Empire. And Negri had this idea that the future kind of revolutionary subject, would no longer be the proletariat, which was kind of the industrial kind of urban worker, that the future revolutionary subject would be what he called multitude. And multitude were actually the knowledge workers. And Negri talked about how in post-industrial civilization like ours, the most important form of production was no longer stuff, was no longer like typewriters or sewing machines or chairs. The most important form of production was the production of subjectivity itself, the manufacturing of identity, the manufacturing of consciousness, and so on. And I think we're really seeing that. And I think a lot of the reasons why we've moved into this, kind of Trumpian nightmare has to do with the kind of like premonitory fear and anxiety, even among these tech magnates, around what artificial intelligence can do and what it means. So, for instance, now we have like vibe coding. I've never learned programming, but almost anybody just through natural language. But even now, apparently, like if you wanted to do a your own version of, let's say, Facebook or Instagram, you can clone it, in a few hours, working with an AI system. And that's going to become much more. So I think in a way, because I think one of the big questions of our moment is why did these tech oligarchs choose this time to switch allegiances? Because, except for Thiel, who'd been a right-wing ideologue since he was young, the rest of them were sort of like, Obama-ish liberals, Mark Andreessen and even Elon Musk and so on. I think they voted for Biden and so on. So why do they choose this moment to pivot to what's turning out to be a very dangerous form of fascism that doesn't necessarily have a limit? And I think one reason is they were insecure about their own power base, both because China is beginning to outcompete us, like the BYD car, electric car from China, apparently is like, so much cheaper and outperforms the Teslas. So now we have huge imports, taxes, tariffs on, and when even before the tariffs, we couldn't buy a BYD car in the US. So Musk, just to keep his power, sort of had to swivel right. And similarly, we've seen with DeepSeek and TikTok and so on, that China is actually outmaneuvering us in terms of technology. And I think these guys felt very scared and very insecure. And in a way, they decided to grab for sort of this ultimate power gamble, which I think is going to, hopefully will turn out to have been a terrible mistake for them in the future. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I would like to thank you for gracing our virtual halls today. It has been a pleasure as always. I want to let everyone know we posted links in the chat with which you can learn more about his work, also purchase books. Also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today. Want to remind everyone, please do check out his Substack page and also the elevator page. And today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. It's all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So please take care, everyone. Please be kind to each other. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much.